Hello, this is Garth Noyes. Sometime in late 2015, under the pseudonym G.K. Flint, I released the first episode of A History of the King James Bible podcast. The genesis, no pun intended, of the series occurred in 2011 on the 400th anniversary of the publication of the King James Version of the Bible. At that time, I went looking for a podcast series about the King James Version and found while there were a few standalone releases, there was no in-depth series about this most important book. I thought to myself, someone should do that. At the time, I didn't think that person would be me. A few years later, I again went online looking for a series concerning the history of the King James Version of the Bible. It still hadn't been done, so I thought, I'm going to have a crack at it. I then gathered some resources, did the research, and hit record. Over the course of about 18 months, beginning in late 2015, I released 22 episodes of the series, the final episode being released in June 2017. Since its release, I have received the occasional email from listeners, some to thank me for the series, and others asking if there will be further episodes. I have no plans to add to the series, but I thought perhaps I should share the series on YouTube so that others might have a chance to hear it. Which brings us to October 2020, and the series now being made available on YouTube. Any references to the now defunct website or different email addresses can be ignored as you go through the series. If you do wish to contact me, you can email me at gkjames1611@gmail.com. That's gkjames1611 gkjames1611@gmail.com. I will check this email intermittently, so please be patient if you do write. I have already stated the reason I decided to create this series, but my research into the translators unquestionably motivated me to get the research down and to hit record. It is clearly my favourite part of this work, so I am now thrilled anew in October and November of 2020 to offer on YouTube my study on the translators of the King James Bible. So here now for your enjoyment is my original series, A History of the King James Bible podcast.
Welcome, friends, to A History of the King James Bible podcast. To find more episodes and information, just go to our website, www.ahistoryofthekingjamesbiblepodcast.com. Now here is GK with the latest episode.
Well, welcome to episode 15 of A History of the King James Bible podcast. It is September 2016 and we are going to discuss the Second Cambridge Company, the gents who translated the Apocrypha for the king. Now, I'm going to try and avoid the use of the hyperbole here, but this panel has a couple of the most interesting translators I've come across so far, namely Andrew Downes and John Boyce. Just you wait until we get to them. But before we do that, I strongly suggest you go back and listen to episode 14 if you haven't already. It is essential listening before you go ahead and listen to this episode. Now, I got a good amount of feedback about episode 14, which was my interview and discussion with Dr. Mike Spalding about the Apocrypha. We basically just discussed what it is. And I want to say a big thank you to everyone who took the time to write to me about that episode. And not all of you agreed with everything that Pastor Mike and I spoke about, but I appreciate the way each and every one of you approached the topic. To put it plainly, everyone spoke their mind, but they weren't rude about it, and I really appreciate that. I like a good discussion. I like a good argument in the plain sense of the word, but, even if you disagree with one another, you don't have to be rude about it, do you? Now, moving on from that and speaking in general now, I have received a few emails over the course of the series asking me my personal opinion about a few issues surrounding this series. And while I've responded to those inquiries, I want you to know that I'm trying to be as objective about this material as I can. keep in mind, I'm trying to focus upon the history. Okay, so it's the history of the King James Bible. And, I've extended that well back, well before, the King James Bible was even thought of. And who knows where we might go forwards past from when it was first published in 1611. Who knows where it's going to go. But I do want you to get the point here that my main focus is to talk about the historical aspects of the material that I'm dealing with. Now, occasionally my personal bias will creep in. And in fact, in all my years on this planet, I've yet to hear one person speak on a subject that I couldn't detect some bias one way or another on the topic that they were speaking on. It is very difficult to keep your bias out of any topic. It doesn't matter. Just name one, whether you like it or not, whether you're for or against whatever the topic is. It is very difficult to keep your bias out of it. That being said, it should be obvious by now, I enjoy history. I like biographies of historical figures. I have a great deal of respect for the King James Version of the Bible. Surprise, surprise. I'm sure some of you are very shocked at hearing that now. I've got a great deal of respect for the translators themselves, warts and all, because they're not all perfect. Hey, who is? We're all imperfect beings, right? I have immense awe at the impact that this Bible, this book, had upon the English-speaking world. I think I said in the first episode, it just can't be calculated, right? The impact is, in my opinion, it's impossible to calculate. I personally think King James was a good king, relatively speaking. Compare him to all of the other monarchs, let's easily say 300 years before and 300 years after him. Let's just pick that range. Any monarch, any nation, by far, comparatively speaking, he stands out, right? I mean, and for me personally, so does good Queen Bess, Elizabeth I, Queen Victoria, and a couple of others, but, we won't get into that. But, relatively speaking, okay? Now that I've said that, I was thinking about, perhaps maybe, sharing things of a more personal nature in the final episode of this series. Why the King James Version means so much to me personally, and other related material. And perhaps I was planning to be a little bit more subjective than I'm allowing myself to be in these preceding episodes, right? And who's to know when that episode's going to happen and what we're going to talk about, but I was hoping to leave that on the back burner for now. So those of you that have got questions, appreciate them about my personal opinion, and if I can help you in any way I can. Some people have asked me to point them to different things. I'm happy to do that. Happy to field questions about the things that we've discussed here, specifically about the history of the King James Version. But outside of that, let's put it this way, outside of that sort of area, let's just leave the sort of my personal point of view on the back burner for now, because I don't want to let that cloud what I'm doing here. And, when I listen to someone else doing a series on a topic that I enjoy, I certainly, hey, look, I like it when they enjoy, I always like it when I know someone really loves their topic, but I also appreciate it when they're approaching it as objectively as possible. So that's my intention. Yes, my bias is going to creep through it. Like I said before, I defy anybody not to allow their bias to creep through on any subject that you can hear them talk about for any length of time. Get them speaking long enough and you can soon work people out. The old saying, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. But really, if you listen to the words people use, listen closely to what they say, you can soon work out, what their bias is. Okay. And yes, body language plays a lot. You can't see me. They say 80-90% of communication is body language. I'm starting to revise the way I look at that. I've done a couple of rounds of psychology at university, and, I talked about a lot about body language and all of that, and communication and things like that. Yes, it's important. But I'm starting to swing to, it's very, very important to listen to the words that people say. And that, my dear listener, is just my humble opinion. Okay, now, having said that, if you'd like to write to me, you can write to me at gk@likeflintradio.com. I try to answer, well, I don't try to actually. I have answered every email I've received so far. And like I said earlier, everyone has been rather pleasant, and it's been really nice to hear from you. So don't hesitate to write. Love to talk to you about the topic. Love to hear your stories, what your opinion is. I'd like this to be as inclusive as I can. I'd like you to feel that you're a part of it as much as you like. And to that end also, I'd ask you to share the series if you like the series, but don't hesitate to write to me if you would like to talk about any of the topics that we've discussed here. All right, enough rambling from me, because I'm sure I've had enough of it if you haven't. But let's begin with some words from Opfel. We're going to get to our topic here, the Second Cambridge Company and their assignment, the Apocrypha. And we're going to begin with some words from Opfel. So let's go to that now, and I'll come back and talk to you a little bit later on.
The Second Cambridge Company's assignment was the Prayer of Manasses and the rest of the Apocrypha. The other books included 1st and 2nd Esdras, Tobit, Judith, the rest of Esther, the Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, Baruch, the Song of the Three Holy Children, the History of Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. History, fiction, allegory, poetry, varying in appeal and value. The naive and rather extraordinary adventures of Tobit provided a fascinating tale. Coverdale imitated the Bishop's Bible, told the story of Tobit in the third person. Following Geneva's example, the King James scholars used the first person. Judith, the dauntless slayer of Holofernes, was the heroine of exciting short stories. Susanna, falsely accused by a rejected suitor, the heroine of an even more appealing narrative. First Maccabees was accurate history, but above all there was poetry, sometimes lofty in Ecclesiasticus and the Wisdom of Solomon. According to Butterworth, the Second Cambridge Company treated the Apocrypha very independently, revising 2/3 of it completely. The other 1/3 the men got from Coverdale, the Geneva Bible, and the Bishop's Bible. From Esdras to the Wisdom of Solomon, the Bishop's Bible made several original contributions. From Ecclesiasticus on it had kept the Coverdale version. On the reverse side of the coin, some Bible historians believe that in many places the members of the Second Cambridge Company did not exert themselves overmuch. F.H.A. Scrivener notes, "They were content to leave many a rendering of the Bishop's Bible as they found it, when merely any change must have been for the better. Even when their predecessors gave them a better expression, they reverted to undistinguished, mean, almost vulgar turns of phrase."
Their assignment was a section with a peculiar history of exclusion. After the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, Palestinian scholars decided that for the sake of preservation, the Hebrew scriptures should be defined and classified. 20 years later, a list was drawn up of books that were considered authorized as the sacred law, prophets, and writings of the Jewish Church. These became the canon of the Old Testament. Not included in that list were 14 other books used by Jews outside Palestine, which formed part of the Greek version of the Old Testament. Although they could be read privately, they were not intended to be used publicly. Hence they were given the name Apocrypha, which means hidden, actually hidden from public view. Miles Coverdale was the first English translator to present the 14 books in a separate section between the Old and New Testaments. He provided them with the subtitle, "The Books and Treatises which among the fathers of old are not reckoned to be of like authority with the other books of the Bible. Neither are they found in the canon of the Hebrew." After 1535, the Apocrypha was included in all the English Bibles, but starting in 1826, By fiat of the British and Foreign Bible Society, it began to disappear from most Protestant versions. Fittingly, it has been called the Cinderella of Bible translations, insulted, apologized for, rejected throughout its history. Okay, so now let's go meet the translators. What we might do here is I might have my lovely wife read the script for me. So this will be her reading, but my words. Enjoy.
The director of the Second Cambridge Company was John Duport. The Duport family had come to Leicestershire from Normandy during the reign of Henry IV, hence the French surname. Now, like many of our scholars, Duport was well qualified for the job of translator. His resume reads thus. He gained his BA in 1569-70, MA in 1573, DD 1590, Fellow 1574-82, a Proctor in 1580-81, a Master in 1590-1618. He also was Vice-Chancellor in 1593-95, 1601-02, 1609-10. He became an ordained deacon on the 17th of November 1577 and a priest on the 17th of April 1580. He was also Master of the Free School, Wotton-under-Edge, Gloucestershire. He was also the Rector of Harleton, Cambridgeshire, Rector of Medbourne, Leicestershire, Rector of Husbands, Bosworth, Rector of Fulham, Middlesex. He was also the Presenter of St Paul's and the Prebendary of Ely. A proctor's role was often that of disciplinarian, so at Jesus College, Cambridge, a student who was guilty of breaking the rules might cop an 8p fine for not wearing the proper gown and hood when walking around the university. Other punishments included getting less food from the kitchen at mealtimes and so forth. He was also 4 times elected Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge, so with this list of achievements you can see, as I said earlier, he was well qualified for the role of translator and director of the Second Cambridge Company. His father-in-law, Richard Cox, an interesting character in his own right, having served under Edward IV, Henry VIII, Good Queen Bess, but surprise, surprise, not under Bloody Mary. In fact, when she came to the throne, he escaped to the continent and remained in exile until Queen Bess took to the throne. Now he was Bishop of Ely, and he helped with the preparation of the Bishop's Bible in his day. As an aside, he also wrote an ode to Anne Boleyn for her coronation. Back to Duport. He and his wife Rachel had 4 sons and 4 daughters, and their son James was later himself a scholar of some note. Now, do you remember that the translators were not paid by the Crown for their work? Well, all except one. We will come to him here shortly. So they weren't paid as such, but they were offered some form of preferment, and as part of his, Duport was made Prebendary of Ely Cathedral in 1609, the same year that Lancelot Andrews, the lead translator, you remember him, became bishop there. Now, in basic terms, a prebendary is a senior member of the clergy who is supported by the revenues of a particular parish. So our company director has a lot of letters after his name, including that ever-present DD, Doctor of Divinity. Celebrated for his knowledge of Greek is our next translator, William Branthwaite. He was, however, skilled also in Hebrew. An undergrad of Clare Hall, Cambridge, in 1584 became a founding fellow of Emmanuel College under Lawrence Chatterton. Remember him from the First Cambridge Company? Branthwaite, a Doctor of Divinity, became Master of Gonville and Caius College. Apparently the first of 18 family members to attend this place. That's nice, isn't it? Our next translator is one of the more interesting members of the Second Cambridge Company, one Samuel Ward. During the time of the translation, he was very good friends with the Irish clergyman James Ussher, who was later famous for giving us the actual date of the creation of the world. Now, just so you know, according to the proleptic Julian calendar, Google that, it's interesting, but according to this calendar, at approximately 6 p.m. on the 22nd of October 4004 BC, the world was created. So put that one in the memory bank, it may come up on some quiz somewhere. Okay, so now let us refer to Opfel for some in-depth info on D.D. Samuel Ward.
Ward was born around 1572 at Bishop Middleham in the county of Durham. Although his family was of more ancientry than estate, he matriculated at Cambridge as a pensioner, not as a sizer. He received his B.A. from Christ Church in 1592, his M.A. in 1596, then later he was elected a Fellow of Emmanuel. Fellows were commonly supposed to take orders, a requirement Puritans saw as a call to preach. But since Ward had an impediment in his speech, he received somewhat grudging approval from the authorities. At Christ Church, he had been a great admirer of the Puritan scholar William Perkins, and at Emmanuel he came under its strong Puritan influence. During the years 1595 to 1599, the introspective young Samuel Ward kept a diary in which he was scrupulously honest with himself. Early on, he found fault with his dullness in the morning in prayer, his little affection in hearing Mr. Chatterton's good sermon upon the 34th verse of the 25 of Matthew. Likewise, he disparaged his desire for preferment, his sin of pride, his sluggish attention to other sermons. Among many shortcomings, he also bemoaned my negligence in serious meditating of my translating, my gluttony in eating plums and raisins, my immoderate eating of walnuts and cheese after supper, and yet again my longing after damsons when I made my vow not to eat in the orchard. One entry expresses shame for my little pity of the boy who was whipped in the hall. Still another entry goes, my incontinent thoughts at Hobson's, my overgreat mirth as he went to Hinton. Undoubtedly, the reference is to Hobson, the carrier, many of whose clients came from the university. Beginning with a cart and 8 horses in 1560, Hobson had built over the years a transport service that was known all over East Anglia. He also had horses for hire and decreed that a customer must always take the horse nearest the stable door, Hobson's choice, being insurance that the horses would get their fair share of galloping and rest. Another time Ward counts as a sin my impatiency with Hobson when he had no letters for me. After his father's death, Samuel bore the chief burden in supporting his relatives. Years later he wrote, my estate hath always been far away from any considerable greatness, and the greater part of it spent in maintaining my poor kindred and in buying books necessary for my profession. Burdened by responsibilities he might be, but soon the rise to prominence began. When Ward helped a friend publish a Latin treatise, he addressed James in so fulsome a preface that the king soon after appointed him one of the royal chaplain. He became a doctor of divinity in 1610, shortly after his work on the Apocrypha was completed. He is said to have paid special attention to the prayer of Manassas and 1st and 2nd Maccabees. About the same time, he was named master of Sidney Sussex College. Sussex men, who were not to display long curled hair, huge ruffs, or velvet pantaloons, were further advised to keep away from taverns and to refrain from dice and cards. 7 years after his appointment, Ward welcomed there the 17-year-old Oliver Cromwell, who matriculated as a fellow commoner the very day, April 23, 1616, that William Shakespeare died. Among Ward's pupils were Thomas Fuller, the future church historian, and Seth Ward, who was to give Samuel much devotion and care in the declining years. Contemporary accounts picture Samuel Ward as a moderate Puritan who remained deeply attached to the Church of England. Later, he turned increasingly conservative. After his Bible task was over, Ward went on to new honors, prebendary and canon residentry of the splendid Wells Cathedral, Archdeacon of Taunton, prebendary of York, rector of Great Mundon, Hertfordshire, and of Tarrington, Norfolk, and Lady Margaret, Professor of Divinity at Cambridge. Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, was the founder of St. John's and Christ's colleges. All the while, Ward remained a central figure at the university and assisted his Irish friend Ussher with his patristic researches. Still, his pluralism and non-residency gave his good friends some concern. In 1618, Samuel Ward was one of the English delegates to the synod of the Dutch Reformed Church in Dort, where somebody pronounced him the most learned man in the assemblage. In Latin, he gave a report of the very accurate English translation lately set forth, with great care and at great expense, by the most serene King James. Ward noted caution was given that an entirely new version was not to be furnished, but an old version, long received by the church, to be purged from all blemishes and faults. To this end, there was to be no departure from the ancient translation unless the truth of the original text or emphasis demanded. With this statement, he gave prominence to Bishop Bancroft's first rule about following the bishop's Bible and overlooked the 14th rule, which listed other translations to be used when they agree better with the text than the bishop's. Nor did Ward mention the creative contributions of the companies themselves. Although retiring and modest, he felt obliged by the temper of the times to engage in controversy, even attacking a man he had once served as chaplain. But his interests were not all ecclesiastical. Once he wrote to his friend, the great physician William Harvey, of his intention to send a petrified skull to King James for his inspection. Ward was past 50 when he married a widow who had a daughter. Notwithstanding the fact that he had been master of Sidney, Sussex, when Oliver Cromwell entered there as a student, Ward suffered during the Civil War for his dogged faithfulness to the crown. His Puritanism had long since given way. For a time, he was imprisoned in St. John's College, but when his health deteriorated, he was allowed to retire to Sidney, Sussex, where he died in 1643.
You're listening to a History of the King James Bible podcast with GK. The series is now available on iTunes. Just go to iTunes and search for a History of the King James Bible podcast with G.K. Flint as the author. If you enjoy this series, please leave a rating and a review. You can also find links to every episode at our website. Just head to www.ahistoryofthekingJamesBiblePodcast.com. Now let's get back to this episode with your host, G.K.
Just before we move on, I'd like to give a couple of shout-outs here. Greetings to you, Mark in Ireland, and Joel from California. Thank you both for your emails. I enjoyed conversing with you. That was fantastic. And also to all our listeners in Spain, in France, in Germany, and especially those in the Philippines. I've noticed our audience in the Philippines has grown quite a lot lately, so greetings to all of you in the Philippines and God bless. Now, before we get to our next translator here, let's talk a little bit about Hobson, who you heard Samuel Ward talking about here just a bit earlier. From Hobson, we get the saying Hobson's choice. Let me read, for your edification, because this is interesting, a little bit about him directly from good old Wikipedia. A Hobson's choice is a free choice in which only one thing is offered. Because a person may refuse to accept what is offered, the two options are taking it or take nothing. In other words, one may take it or leave it. The phrase is said to have originated with Thomas Hobson, a livery stable owner in Cambridge, England, who offered customers the choice of either taking the horse in his stall nearest the door or taking none at all. The term Hobson's choice is often misused to mean a false illusion of choice. But it is not a choice between two equivalent options, which is a Morton's fork, nor it is a choice between two undesirable options, which is a dilemma. Hobson's choice is one between something or nothing. According to a plaque underneath a painting of Hobson donated to Cambridge Guildhall, Hobson had an extensive stable of some 40 horses. This gave the appearance to his customers that, upon entry, that customer would have his or her choice of mounts, when in fact there was only one. Hobson required his customers to choose the horse in the stall closest to the door. This was to prevent the best horses from always being chosen, which would have caused those horses to become overused. Henry Ford was also said to have offered the Ford Model T with the famous Hobson's choice. Any customer can have a car painted any colour that he wants as long as it is black. However, factually speaking, the car was actually offered in a variety of colours in the earliest days. All right, so that's interesting, isn't it? Just a little aside there. Let's move on to our next translator.
Okay, so let's move on to the fourth translator of the Second Cambridge Company, Andrew Downes, who has the distinction of being the only translator to receive any do-re-mi directly from the Crown. Born in the county of Shropshire, Downes is credited with doing much to revive the study of Greek at St John's College, Cambridge, along with his star pupil John Boyce, whom we will be visiting with next. Around 1585, when he was Regius Professor of Greek, Cambridge was a community of scholars, pupils and townsfolk with a population of around 6,500. Some 1,500 belonged to the uni. Every September, Opville says that both the town and gown enjoyed the Great Fair at Stourbridge Common, the model for Vanity Fair in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Now to something that Downes is uniquely known for among the translators. In 1608, he asked King James for a royal grant, which was granted the following year. He received 50 quid, a pretty penny back in the olden days. Now another thing I think Downes is unique for is that he is also the only translator to have had the Wallopers called on him. He must have at some time been a bit slack in his duties because the royal pursuivants, they were the royal police at the time, had to occasionally summon him to his duties. He is also known for his disagreement with our next translator, John Boyce. If there was a super translator in the Second Cambridge Company, Boyce was it. Not only did he work on the Apocrypha with the Second Cambridge Company, he also assisted the First Cambridge Company with their work on First Chronicles to the Song of Solomon. And he was a member of the General Committee, the Board of Review, to whom all the company sent their final work for review. We will get to that in an upcoming episode. Boyce was born in Nettlestead, Suffolk, and by the age of 5 he was reading the Bible in Hebrew, and at 6 he was able to write the Hebrew letters. In 1575, at the age of 15, he went to St John's College, Cambridge, where he was soon proficient in Greek, to go along with his Hebrew. His mentor and teacher in Greek was old mate Andrew Downes. His whole life he was known to be both a hypochondriac and a health addict. Perhaps this was because of all of his siblings, he was the only one to reach adulthood. His father was proficient in both Greek and Hebrew and taught his son during his childhood. His mother was known for having read the Bible through 12 times and the Book of Martyrs twice. At school, Boyce was a classmate of John Overall, a member of the First Westminster Company. Do you remember him? It seems like so long ago, yet only yesterday that we discussed him. I'm kidding. It's funny how many of these guys crossed paths as they were growing up and being educated, as Boyce was also known to be somewhat of a fan of Edward Lively, himself a translator from the First Cambridge Company. While at St John's, Boyce was known to go to the library at 4 a.m. and remain there without a break until 8 p.m. that night. Eventually, he was elected a Fellow of St John's. At the time, he was suffering from smallpox, a terrible disease then and now, and he had to be carried to the ceremony wrapped in blankets. He started out at university studying medicine, but because he thought he was suffering from every ailment that he was studying, he quit and decided to study divinity. He became a deacon one day in June 1583 and was ordained a priest the very next. He went on to teach Greek at his college for 10 years. Let's turn now to McClure for more about Boyce.
When he was about 36 years old, Mr. Holt, rector of Boxworth, died, leaving the advowson of that living in part of a portion to one of his daughters, and requesting of some of his friends that, if it might be procured, Mr. Boyce of St. John's College might become his successor. The matter being intimated to that gentleman, he went over to take a view of the lady, thus singularly portioned, and commended to his favourable regards. The parties soon took a sufficient liking to each other, and the somewhat mature lover was presented to the parsonage by his future bride and instituted by Archbishop Whitgift, October 13th, 1596. He fulfilled the other part of the bargain by marrying the lady, February 7th, 1598, and so resigned his beloved fellowship at St. John's. He could not, however, wholly separate himself from old associates and pursuits. Every week he rode over from Boxworth to Cambridge to hear some of the Greek lectures of Downes and the Hebrew exercises of Lively, and also the divinity acts and lectures. Every Friday he met with neighbouring ministers, to the number of 12, to give an account of their studies and to discuss difficult questions. While thus absorbed in studious pursuits, he left his domestic affairs to the management of his wife, whose want of skill in a few years reduced him to bankruptcy. He was forced to part with his chief treasure and to sell his library, which contained one of the most complete and costly collections of Greek literature that had ever been made. Now, I have heard about this before. Boyce's collection of Greek literature was amazing, and second only to one of the major libraries in the world. I just can't remember. I read it several years ago, but it was like the second best collection of Greek literature in the world at the time. I think the best in the British Isles, and only beaten by one library in Europe, and forgive me, I just can't remember it. The cruel loss so disheartened him as almost to drive the poor man from his family and his native country. He was, however, sincerely attached to his wife, with whom he lived in great happiness and affection for 45 years. Well, how about that, gentlemen? When your wife sends you bankrupt and you have to part with your beloved Greek books, and you still love her and stay married to her, I think that's quite something. Good on you, Mr. Boyce. After the completion of the Apocrypha, the portion assigned to his company, the other Cambridge company, to whom was assigned from Chronicles to the Canticles inclusively, earnestly entreated his assistance, as he was equally distinguished for his skill in Greek and Hebrew. They were the more earnest for his aid because of the death of their president, Professor Lively, which took place shortly after the work was undertaken. During the 4 years thus employed, Mr. Boyce gave close attention to the duty, from Monday morning to Saturday evening, spending the Sabbaths only at his rectory with his family. For all this labour he received no worldly compensation, except the use of his chambers and his board in commons. He rendered a vast amount of aid to his fellow translator, Sir Henry Saville, in his great literary undertaking, the edition of Chrysostom. Sir Henry speaks of him, in the preface, as the most ingenious and most learned Mr. Boyce, and it is said that the aged Professor Downes was so much hurt at the higher commendations bestowed upon his quondam pupil's share in that labour than upon his own, that he never got entirely over it. So I think we mentioned earlier that Downes was annoyed, or however I put it, with Boyce at some stage in their life, and it seems that this is what it was over, that he was spoken so highly of by Sir Henry Saville. Mr. Boyce, however, did not cease to regard his veteran instructor with the utmost respect and esteem. For his many years of hard labour bestowed upon Chrysostom, he received no compensation except a single copy of the work. This was probably owing to the sudden demise of Sir Henry Saville, who was intending to make him one of the Fellows of Eton College. Mr. Boyce continued to be quite poor and neglected till Dr. Lancelot Andrews, then Bishop of Ely, and who had also been employed in the Bible translation, of his own accord made him a prebendary of the Cathedral Church of Ely in 1615. He there spent the last 28 years of his life, in studious retirement, providing a curate for Boxworth. After his removal to Ely, he visited Boxworth twice a year to administer the sacraments and preach, and to relieve the wants of the poor. He left at his death as many leaves of manuscript as he had lived days in his long life, for even in his old age he spent 8 hours in daily study, mostly reading and correcting ancient authors. Among his writings was a voluminous commentary in Latin on the Gospel and Acts, which was published some 12 years after his decease. He was of a social and cheerful disposition, and had a great fund of anecdote at command. He kept up a strict family government. His charity to the necessitous poor was limited only by the bottom of his purse. Though he chose the lazy, knowing that charity's eyes should be open as well as her hands, he was in fastings oft, sometimes twice in the week, and punctual in all religious duties. His preaching was without notes, though not without much prayer and study. In performing this solemn duty, his main endeavour was to make himself easily understood by the humblest and most ignorant of his hearers. This is a wise and noble trait in one of such vast acquirements. He was so familiar with the Greek Testament that he could at any time turn to any word that it contained. His manner of living was quite peculiar. He was a great pedestrian all his days. He was also a great rider and swimmer, and possessed a very strong constitution, which all his hard study could not impair. He took but 2 meals, dinner and supper, and never drank at any other time. He would not study between supper and bedtime, but spent the interval in pleasant discourse with friends. He took special care of his teeth, and carried them nearly all to the grave. Up to his death, his brow was unwrinkled, his sight clear, his hearing quick, his countenance fresh, and head not bald. He ascribed his health and longevity to the observance of 3 rules, given him by one of his college tutors, Dr. Whitaker. First, always to study standing. Secondly, never to study in a draught of air. And thirdly, never go to bed with his feet cold. Sounds like good advice to me. He had 4 sons and 3 daughters. The firstborn died an infant. The second son and eldest daughter he saw married. The third son died of consumption at the age of 30, at Ely, where he was a canon in the cathedral. The younger son died of the smallpox while a student of St. John's College. Thus the father was not without his sore afflictions. These seem to have been sanctified to his good. He said of himself near the end of his life, "There has not been a day for these many years in which I have not meditated at least once upon my death." Thus he met death at last with great joy as an old acquaintance and long-expected friend. Having survived his wife for 2 lonesome years, Mr. Boyce had himself carried about 5 hours before his end into the room where she had died. He there expired on the Lord's Day, January 14th, 1643, and that'll be the phone. He there expired on the Lord's Day, January 14th, 1643, in the 84th year of his age. He went unto his rest on the day of rest, a man of peace, to the God of peace.
Our next translator is Jeremiah Radcliffe, whose brother, Eddie, was King James's physician. Radcliffe held a BA, MA, BD, and yes, a DD. During the time of the translation, he was the Vicar of Orwell. Our final translator in this company is Robert Ward, or John Ward as McClure has his name. As far as we know, he was no relation to Samuel Ward, also of this company. Admitted to King's College from Eton at age 17, Robert Ward matriculated in 1588, gained his B8 in 1592-93, his MA in 1596, his BD in 1603, and of course his DD in 1609. He was elected Fellow in 1591 to 1609. Well, that is our list of translators of the Second Cambridge Company who translated the Bible for the King. I'll now hand you back to GK because I need to go and make him some tea and scones.
You beauty. Thanks, honey. I do like my tea and scones. What a surprise. How did they make their way into the script for this episode? Okay. Well, that'll do us for this episode. Join us next time as we visit with the Second Oxford Company and make our first foray into the New Testament. So until then, take care, God bless, and hooroo.
Shropshire. Shropshire. Dewport. Okay, stop.
Who Samuel wore. It's the first one you hit without a muck up.
That's going in the outtakes. You roasted me over the coals. It's the first one you did without a muck up. Isn't that something?